Yeah, it's like if you're really into like.
People used to do that like have like different fonts and like backgrounds.
Yeah, you can do that, or you can get like a Game Boy emulator. Except that I always. There are that.
Sí, para como
She said she's small and she looks
Okay.
She said she was gonna be but she has a whole bunch of and I don't want to do that. The only I'm honestly surprised she didn't want people to make things because I was like, well, maybe we would be more than or she's gonna be awesome. Okay. She goes, I have to be at 4:25. So I looked up for I didn't even want to but she's really sweet. That's crazy. But she basically said, same thing as you. There just needs to be like
are not any more.
Well, the reason I got a call is
My solar is supposed to remember coming in classes that thing. And I did 9 years ago. I spent plenty of time doing that. And I was just saying, you know, I mean, you know how this happens, right? Yeah, I actually just created one of my songs.
And so I'm gonna do I started seeing
For the year? Yeah.
You want to like I'm gonna
Is it a story you can tell?
So I've been here 10 years.
oh, sorry.
And so Scott
He's at it.
was he was later and then another person
Sure.
He said he couldn't do it. So it's one of those chains of
Man.
Yes. I apologize for the way we were.
You know what? It's very typical. You never quite know what you're going to get sometimes. Sometimes they're very
Literally, office is asking
Everybody else is
Yeah.
All right. Hey, everybody, let's begin. So the overall agenda for this evening is that we'll hear from our guest speaker, have a chance to converse with her. And based on the posts that everybody submitted on the readings, I think there'll be terrific interaction with our guest presentation and your comments. Then we'll do our break and we'll do a discussion of the cases, but I'm intentionally going to shorten that so that there's time for your groups to do some work, but also I have nearly all of the drafts done for your papers, and I'm going to get those back to you, and then maybe we can do, for people who aren't clear on either my handwriting or my comments, want to chat about that. We could do some sort of in-class conversations before that might clarify things. So that's the overall agenda. Quick reminder, the online evaluations for the law school, the class evaluations are open, so please do that. I had a horrendously low participation rate last year. Now that may be because I also hand out in class. The Humphrey is still in paper because we think we get better participation doing it on paper in class. So I also hand out the Humphrey evaluation. So that may have accounted for the low participation rate in the law school evaluation, but it would be great if you would do both for law students. Okay, so Sarah Vernig is an area or district-wide principal at Osseo school system, and before that she was a teacher, but also served in administration as an assistant principal and also as a principal at Maple Grove Senior High School, which is a really big high school. And she's been, as she will tell you, in her district-wide role, has been working on issues of school safety and responses to discipline issues. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and let her explain more about how she ended up being a district-wide principal.
Sure. Do you have a clicker somewhere?
Unfortunately, I don't. So
That's-
arrow key.
Yep, we'll
Yeah.
just work our way
Next
through it.
acquisition.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me here and giving me the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about some of the experiences that I have almost on a daily basis. As Mr. Kelly mentioned, I was the principal at Maple Grove and Osseo area schools for 5 years, and then after that, I've been in this role now, the district level principal role, this is my 3rd year. Our district, and you'll see a little bit of this in some of this information that I give you, is quite large. And because of that, we have 3 assistant superintendents, a superintendent, and then myself, who handle most of the major concerns, complaints, and priority work that we do, along with a level of cabinet and directors and so forth. My primary responsibility, I always tell people, it's kind of the meatloaf job. So if you think about, when you think about school discipline, I handle all of the major issues that come our way. Expulsions, I run the hearings, I work with our general counsel in collaboration with them to put together those hearings. So it's all the big major pieces, all the way down to just general expectations, student expectations in buildings, and helping schools organize and plan those. I also run the priority work around restorative practices and positive behavior interventions and support, so trying to not look at it as a retributive process, but rather more a restorative process. In addition to that, I also serve on the policy committee, so I help refine and define components of our district level policies that also govern what we want to be practicing within our sites and provide some application to that. I'm also in charge of the activities and athletics for the entire district, so I coordinate, I work with the activities coordinators. And so as you can imagine, and as I read through the list of articles that you guys have been reading, Title IX and the transgender component to it has been an interesting topic. So we've had several conversations about that. Lastly, I serve as a support person for all principals and assistant principals, and I also get all of the parent complaints or concerns that come to the superintendent, so I serve as the superintendent's ombudsman as well. So it's kind of the meatloaf job, is what like I said. So anyway, tonight I just want to give you just a quick overview of our district so you understand how sort of law and the discipline system has contextually been and what we've changed to try and address some of the components that we are seeing frequently in the news, in the politics, and what people are talking about. So Osseo Area Schools is the 5th largest district in Minnesota with 22,000 students. We have 3 comprehensive high schools. We have an ALC, we've got 4 middle schools, 17 elementary schools, an adult basic education program, and also an early childhood program. Historically, when you look at our discipline policies, we used to have matrices. We had an elementary matrix and a secondary matrix, and it was pretty delineated by if this, then this, and if this, then that, and you would go through it, and it would be from everything to possession of a lighter, tardy policies, truancy policies, all the way down to possession of handguns, weapons, arson, those kinds of things. What was always hard about that, and even as when I started in this district, because I've been there now 8 years, is that there was never consensus on some of those gray areas. So there are lots of disciplinary incidences that happen in schools that are pretty cut and dry. And then there's that gray area. So what exactly, and this is something that nationwide everyone struggles with, what exactly is disruptive behavior? What exactly is insubordination? It's kind of like when people talk about disorderly conduct, what does that mean? There's so much of that could fall under that category. And so we never really had a consistent idea about what that would look like or what that would truly mean. We started working on PBIS officially, I would say, this is our 6th year now. When I started back 8 years ago, that was kind of my passion, was culture and climate and helping people belong, feeling like they're part of a community and providing that sense of a safe and healthy learning environment for them. So, which is kind of how I ended up getting transitioned into this role 5 years later. So it was integrated into our priority work, so some of our priority goals and our statements around our mission and our vision and our strategic plan. And that priority work has continued and continues today. We changed our student management practices in 2015 when I took over this role to really start looking at the context or what the situation was that got the student into the situation they're in, rather than looking at those discipline matrices again, because you couldn't always fit it into a category that worked well. And there are times where kids were being punished for things, such as being suspended, for things that really you didn't want to have to suspend them for. For example, as you know, there was a big no tolerance push a long time ago regarding weapons, and that included pocket knives and things. Sometimes we have kids who go hunting or they went off on a camping trip and they forget the pocket knife. We don't want to be expelling kids because ultimately we want them in school. We also have we call them student resource officers, but they're police officers in each of our secondary sites. As he mentioned, our secondary sites are quite big. Our smallest high school has 2,000 kids in it, and Maple Grove has 2,350 in it. And then our middle schools are conversely very big too, averaging about 1,200 kids in it per building. So we need some resource in there and some help just because of the sheer volume and the magnitude. What's been very clear and what we worked very hard on doing is separating the police consequences from the student consequences to make sure that parents, students, and families understand our job is to fix and repair that relationship and help kids make better decisions. But
sometimes things are so egregious, there will be police consequences, but you're going to deal with them over here. So they only intervene when asked, and that's typically in cases when you're finding drugs on kids, if there's a fight, or weapons of any kind. But outside of the rest of it, they're not involved in that. So that's a little bit of the context piece. As you may or may not know, there was new legislation that was put into effect and actually went into effect August 1st around having positive behavioral interventions and supports within your school-wide plans. And each of these highlighted areas that are red, sort of, are the ones that are really the key components and have been for many years of PBIS, and that we continue to use as our line of thinking as we're putting in those disciplinary supports. So it's about having these 3 to 5 positively stated expectations. We're making decisions based on data. We want to make sure we're putting in specialized support systems for kids to make sure that they are succeeding, and that there's a continuum, much like I talked about earlier, of evidence-based interventions that helps kids make better decisions. So it was really nice to see that this was actually put into law now. So we have to follow it, and it gives us some teeth to continue the work that we're doing. Because the backlash is, as you know and you read, is that the other side of the narrative that you seem to hear and read a lot in the media is about these buildings are unsafe, these kids are hurting people, what are you going to do about them, why do they still get to go to school? Well, they're kids. I mean, and we need to be educating them. There's also some existing laws that also frames our disciplinary work around the People Fair Dismissal Act and what we can do that governs the due process and what we can't do when we suspend kids or we exclude them from their classes or expel them. There's also the Individuals with Disability Act that also requires us to continue to serve the educational needs of students regardless of the disciplinary nature. And so many times people will ask, well, how come that kid still is getting an education? Because we're required by federal law. So we still have to provide alternative educational systems. Out of those frameworks, then we also have these existing board policies. As I mentioned to you, I review them with our policy board committee annually, most of these. But the one driving policy that has been working for us that kind of sits as the umbrella, which is why it's Policy 101, is our work around equity. And we have had extensive training and conversation about race and how race plays into the implicit or the explicit biases of people of what they believe should be happening with kids or to kids in school. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We have our discipline policy. Every school district is required to have one. We have a harassment policy, again, required to have. There's also a separate policy around student suspension that is really meant to lay out for practitioners, administrators, exactly what's going to happen, and then exclusion and expulsion. And we've kept those separately because we want to be able to define what those consequences would look like, but also provide people the opportunity to understand exactly what our process would be. We have a couple different people that we're accountable to. You may or may not have heard that the Office of the Minnesota Department of Human Rights has now started looking at disproportionality and discipline data, which is where they get it from the Minnesota Department of Education in a reporting system. We're required to report every suspension or every exclusion with every kid every year in every site, and that's K-12. Then we also have the Office of Civil Rights where there's a biennial report that's due that they also look at that same data. And then this year, now, as like I said, as you may have heard, the Office of Human Rights has now cited 26 school districts and 9 charter schools for having disproportionate numbers of students of color, particularly black students, being suspended, expelled, or excluded from school versus their white counterparts. So as I mentioned, our racial equity work in Osseo area schools is very important, and a lot of our thinking and a lot of our conversations is around this theory of action, and it's really trying to create and maintain a systemic set of practices that ends up examining our beliefs, our assumptions, and our own biases so we can continue to make ideas or changes to what we're doing to help inform how kids are being treated in our schools and how they're also being exposed to instruction and curricular components. This is just an example of one of the tools we talk about a lot about critical race theory and what that means, what white privilege is, the permanence of racism and the systemic historical permanence of racism and how that's impacted and institutionalized within our school system. And so we're constantly working on trying to revise and refine that as well. What you can see from here is that over the last 8 years now, we started, and these are out of school suspensions, and this is just the number of times kids were suspended, not the number of days. So we had almost 2,500 suspensions district-wide in 2010, and as we've continued to implement these systems, you can see that the number has dropped, with the exception of here. The difference here is only because we had a grade configuration change, and this is where my theory is that for the most part, culture is pretty well established, rules, expectations are pretty well established until you hit here. And then you have to redo it when you have a grade configuration change. So our schools were K-6, 7, 9, 10, 12 until 2016. We're now in our third year. When you change that and you move out half of the population or you move out and put in half of new staff, that changes people's assumptions, belief, and the culture that you've built, which then in turn you're seeing an uptick in some of this. We also had more students, so that was part of it. When I talk about race, we always also look at our data by race, and the red down here indicates our black students that were suspended, the number of times our black students were suspended, compared to our white students, which is here. And as you can see, the disparity, if you added all the other subgroups together, is quite frightening. This is a nationwide issue, and it's one that is constantly talked about in the press. Edina Public Schools has been in the press over this. Wayzata was in there. There's Eden Prairie has been in there. But this is what we're really talking about, this disproportionality and suspensions. Typically speaking, nationwide, it's that our black students are being suspended 3 times the rate that our white students are in our district right now. Even though our suspensions have gone down, we are sitting at, they are responsible for about 80% of our suspensions. So almost 4 times as likely. I talked a little bit about the positive behavior interventions and supports, and it's really this tiered system of intervention. So tier 1 is really all about addressing common expectations and how to manage yourself and making sure that kids know them and are taught them, and that they continue to understand that this is kind of their core components of this is how you behave in the classroom, this is how you behave in the hallway, this is how you act in the cafeteria or the playground. Tier 2 is really about the smaller group of kids who haven't quite gotten it and need some additional remediation or instruction. And the Tier 3 are some of those more significant behaviors that really require individualized plans for them. So the idea behind restorative practices and why it's become so popular is because it's actually helping kids process information. And when you think about the difference between the retributive versus the restorative side, the retributive side is really based more on our criminal system, our criminal justice system, and what our British law used to be way back. And the fact that it is not about the person who, the victim, it is about the person who committed the crime. So the responsibility lies upon them to make things right. So when you think about it, they're either guilty or they're not. We even use terminology in our discipline reform or in our discipline practices about victims, assault, the incident, and it's really more about accountability in the same language. The blame fixing is only on that individual, and there really isn't any way to make it right with the person that was harmed. On the other side of it is, it does still hold people accountable, and you'll hear the people in the news, in articles talk about, well, they're just talking. That's all they ever do with kids. And the reality is that this actually gives both sides the opportunity to be addressed, not just one. In addition, it's about the victims and what they need, and about making things right, whether that's a community, a classroom, a group of friends, an individual. It's about trying to make sure that they understand that, and that the person who did it also understands and accepts responsibility, whatever that might be, and knows how to do things and process things differently the next time. So I talked about this piece already, but if there are really some unintended outcomes of suspensions and expulsions, and that's really around the fact if kids are not in class, they can't learn. And then you start to see student achievement scores drop overall on proficiency, and that's contributing to our learning achievement gap in our reading and writing and our math scores and our science scores. We've also, now this last couple of years, I've also been doing trauma training for our principals, our assistant principals, and our leadership groups, because we also are recognizing that it's not just about restoring, but we also have to recognize that people have trauma in their lives, and that's going to impact how they respond to people, whether it's through fight, flight, or freeze. It's that instinctual need, and then how do we help provide a different outcome for them through a safer learning environment, through consistency and common expectations. If you've read it before, the Adverse Child Experiences Study is a really interesting study that actually came out of a study that was done in San Diego, California back in the 90s with about 17,000 people who they were trying to find why people were having health issues tied to more or less obesity. And then they would see people who were obese, that had heart disease, they were coming in with these commonalities. And what they found was that when they had these adverse childhood experiences, it literally changed the chemical components of their brains to how they responded to things. So they started creating a checklist. Most people associate some of the behavior like fighting, acting out, screaming, punching people, hitting people with it's just bad behavior. Some of these kids, some of these people are wired that way because of the experiences they had. Typically those experiences revolve around alcohol use or abuse, family abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, the common themes that you would think of when you think of some traumatic events. The interesting thing about the study, though, for me, what kind of gave me the aha was the fact that when people would talk about it, you would make an assumption. This is my implicit bias. I'll say I made an assumption that we're really talking about low income, kind of poverty-stricken people, and the reality was the 17,000 people were predominantly white upper middle class women that they had studied and found these common patterns with. So it runs across all classes, runs across all races and genders. And it's really just about trying to provide some safe spaces, slow down, use some transitions, and build common and consistent relationships with kids. We use functional behavior assessments as well. It's really just meant to identify what is the antecedent to the behavior, what is the behavior, and then what's the consequence for them. So what's happening before, what's happening when the behavior happens that we don't want to have happen, and what's happening afterwards. Usually they've been used in the past for students who have been identified as special ed, but we've also modified that in our district to make a shortened version to help with our general ed kids to get them from being identified for special ed, because in the end, we also know that our black males are overrepresented in our special ed numbers as well too, because they're exhibiting some of this behavior. So we're trying to stop that referral process prior to them. We have alternative to suspension rooms. I used to think of them as in-school suspension rooms. They aren't anymore. What they are is that they are spaces where kids go that it might be a behavior that they wouldn't necessarily be suspended for, but it's egregious enough that they need to be out of the classroom for a while. So we've made a policy, or a practice, I should say, in our school system to not suspend kids for anything but unsafe behavior. And we typically categorize that as assaults or fights, drugs, weapons. Yeah, and that's about it. So it's those kind of categorical things. The rest of it, if you have a kid who swears at a teacher, who's mad, who destroys something, we try and put them in an ATS room where they process what they're doing and what happened. And they have a teacher there, they still get their assignments, they usually get motor breaks, and they're trying to figure out how to keep them in school so they're learning rather than sitting at home playing video games and sleeping. These are just some of our partners that we have, Cornerstone, People Inc. These are all nonprofit, most of them, organizations that come in and also provide counseling and therapy services to our students when needed. We also have permanent people in the buildings at full time that work with a certain number of people on their caseload, anywhere from about 15 to 19 per person. The community mediation and restorative services also does community mediation with police departments and governmental services, but they work with us as well too to try and repair that information or the incident that happened in the community. So it's changed our priority work. Instead of just focusing on PBIS to be inclusive of that being culturally responsive and research-based, but using those trauma-informed and restorative practices to try and keep kids in school, keep them learning. So that's kind of what we've been doing. Then we also have a partnership with Education Minnesota, which is our union, our teachers, our secretaries, our teacher aid union people that have come together, and they wrote this report. I actually went to New York with them last year and helped finalize some of the data that's in there. But they are also in response to what's going on and what our teachers have been experiencing and what you're seeing in videos on news clips on Channel 5. They're trying to put some practices in place so teachers are feeling safe again. And they made many of the same recommendations that we've been working on and doing, and have found that it has helped teachers and impacted them in a positive way, so they're not feeling like they're unsure or unsafe going to work. So that's it.
So we'll just grab those two chairs. Questions?
That was kind of a lot of information.
Your SROs, you mentioned that their SROs, there's separate processes, and that the SROs are only interviewed when asked. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that there could be occasions where SRO is in the middle of a situation, or there's not a question of asking because the SRO is a witness to
what had happened. What happens then? Yeah. Frequently it happens. So part of the whole reason we have SROs in that building or in the building is because they're trying to build relationships with kids and teach them that cops are not all bad people. Mm-hmm. But if they're in a cafeteria or in a hallway and a fight breaks out, they're going to intervene because they have a responsibility as well to protect the people that are within that building. Now, when I talk about intervening in cases like that, they will go in and they will do it. But then we try and work and influence them so the kids aren't being charged, they're not being arrested, they're not being taken out in handcuffs and thrown into cars unless it's absolutely necessary. So it's a fine line when that stuff happens, but we don't involve them in anything else. We find drugs on a kid, we'll ask them to come in, we'll ask them to talk with them after we've talked with them and let them do their separate investigation. So we try and keep it separate as much as possible.
So when you talked about the shift towards PBIS as a system, and you talked about how you want to consider the context of the situation, could you kind of explain to me a little more about what things might be traditionally kind of like a context for a situation?
Sure.
Expand what that means?
So I gave the example of the pocket knife because that's probably the most concrete one I can give. We have, our school district encompasses many communities, and some of those communities are very urban communities, and others are have people who are growing up and living on farms. So, for example, we had a student who brought a shotgun to school in his trunk, right, with the shells, because he had been out hunting with his dad, and he was working on the farm, and he took the dad's family truck or car and brought it to school, and the gun was still in there. Well, we can't have shotguns on property, right? And typically in the past, that would be an expulsion right away. But now we listen to the kid's story, we verify it with the dad. He says, yep, Dad, sorry, John took my car this morning, I forgot the gun's in there. And you can't really punish the kid for that. I mean, it's not his fault as long as we can verify that kind of stuff. So there are things like that where we have moved away from that. There are also, as we've worked on our racial equity and work and our lens around what people are perceiving as behaviors that are egregious versus not egregious, we also understand too that there are times where teachers, quite frankly, push kids' buttons and then they react. And so what does that mean and what does that look like? So we want to hear the story. We want to learn the context of how things came to be, so then we know how to appropriately respond.
So it looked like you were getting good results.
Yep.
So, one of the challenges is what you measure, right? So if you're measuring the suspensions, the skeptic could say, oh, well, they were just being more lenient with kids.
Yeah.
And but I'm assuming that the PBIS and other kinds of approaches that you were using also were producing a safer environment.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
How are you measuring that?
So we typically measure 3 different components of it. We look at referrals, we look at suspensions, and then we also look at the number of times kids are in ATS as well. So if they go to alternative suspension room versus that. And what we've seen is that when you look at our data, the data is about consistent with numbers, but more kids are still in school. And so they're learning how to do those processes, which is dropping our suspension numbers. Referrals have always been punitive, and we changed that theory in the past. Our data is a little skewed with referrals because they've always been when the teacher says, whoever, John didn't, he didn't want to do his work. He told me he wasn't going to do it. He ripped up the paper. They would write a referral. Well, we tried to change the thinking instead of it being about now give this kid a consequence because something needs to happen to I need some support with this, whatever that might be, with this kid, with this classroom, and use it more as a tool to ask for help rather than something being punitive to the kid. So it's hard to measure from that component.
Well, another part I wonder about is I think the kids have greater clarity about expectations for them than they might have had 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, so when I was in school, they had a student handbook. It was this big. Whoever read them? Nobody. You always had to sign off you read it, but you never read them. I mean, and that's true. And you'd always find out kind of by default what that policy was. Oh, I was late to class 3 times. Oh, what do you mean I have detention? Okay. It's right here in the handbook, the one I didn't read. So now PBIS really has ingrained that you have to post the stuff, you have to make it clear, you have to make it consistent. So teachers and buildings have posters of their common expectations, and they also have to clarify what those expectations are. So what does tardy mean in my classroom? What does a truancy mean in my classroom within their syllabus? So it's always in their face when we have them teach to those expectations 3 times a year to review them, revise them, and make sure they understand what they are. So it absolutely has, and it makes a difference. It has decreased our referrals for things that kids say, well, I didn't know.
So you didn't say this, but what I inferred was that since PBIS has been implemented, referrals have increased.
No, they've changed, and it's hard to tell if the number, they stayed about the same.
Okay.
That across the board, but it's hard to tell if they would decrease necessarily because most people haven't changed their referral system. So typically speaking, nationwide, if you look at PBIS programs, you'll see a drop and a decrease in referrals. We haven't seen that, and I think that's because we've changed the philosophy of what the purpose of the referral is.
Okay.
So that's why we haven't seen it, but nationally, people would say that you see a definite decrease in that.
Ileana?
Thanks. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. Maybe I'm getting like too narrowed in, but I'm just kind of curious, like the classroom climate for a lot of the schools. Like if it's only like if it's like high class sizes or not high, yeah, high class sizes. Like if there's pairs in the room or like teaching assistants, or if it's like this, teacher by herself sending these kids to the ATS room, or like just what's the classroom like in order to send these kids there, I guess, or.
Sure. So it depends on the grade level. Elementary kids, we try and keep, depending on the grade, around 24 kids. It also will depend with the adults in there. If there are kids in there that have student services or special needs, that they would have a para in there or two. So it will depend from that standpoint. At the secondary levels, the class sizes are bigger. They're closer to 30, 35, so you get a lot of kids in a room. And again, usually that extra support comes in when you have kids who have IEPs or have education plans that have some needs for them. So that, and you'll see a little bit more disruption just because that's why they have IEPs, right? But at the same time, you will get the paras, you'll get teachers, you'll get any staff member that might write a referral. It might be a cook, for example, because someone goes to the lunch line and doesn't pay for their lunch. We're trying to get them to stop doing that, say, knock it off, like that's more of a conversation, like, hey, did you forget to pay for your lunch today? That's okay, come back and pay for it, rather than, he stole from us, and big red marker across the referral,
Molly?
So I'm a huge PBIS person, I love it very much. And in my former school, I spent 6 years at a school that was attempting to implement PBIS every year. And it seemed like the biggest battle was that there was this idea that PBIS was something that somebody else was going to come in and implement for us, and that it was going to work. I'm in a school right now where there's that same sort of idea around restorative justice. Like,
Yeah.
oh, good, somebody's going to come in and do restorative justice for
they're
us.
going to do the things for us, fix
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Fix it, right. It's somebody else is going to come in and do this. And it's my perception is that it really requires a lot of buy-in from every, from the lunch people to the janitors to the classroom teachers. So what has OSCEO done to kind of get that buy-in from the people on the ground to be the ones that actually are the ones that implement this on a daily basis?
So I talked a little bit about this before. I believe personally PBIS is about branding. That's what I believe it's about. Of course, I also, like I said, oversee athletics. I'm a huge sports fan. So I always think of it that way. You identify with things that you know and you can see, and you kind of know what to expect from them. So whether it's the Apple symbol, whether it's the Starbucks symbol, you kind of know what that's about because you've had enough experience with it. So what's worked for us in the buildings that do PBIS well is the branding. And it's included on everything. So when I was in a building, I put our tagline, live each day the Crimson Way, right at the bottom of my emails. It was on top of our meeting minutes. It was on all of our agendas for any meetings we had. We always started with that. So it just became common language. What you're experiencing is very similar. People think that that's the way it's going to work. The greatest buy-in comes in when you get the kids to do it. So once you get the kids saying it, and at first it was like, oh, don't forget, live each day the Crimson Way, and they thought it was kind of a joking thing. But then I was like, hey, why don't you guys make a video and teach kids the expectations? Why don't you do? And then they bought into it, and they started doing it, and then it was like, yeah, that's not Crimson classy. You guys can't be doing that. So it has to be, instead of top down, it has to come from the top to set kind of a guideline, but then give it to the kids and let them run with it. And that's what we've seen with restorative justice too in the circles. Kids will come in and ask for them. Can we have a circle? We're having a problem. We need to talk about this. So it's the same thing.
Josh?
I'm interested in hearing a little more about ATS rooms. I imagine the assumption is it's better to have kids in the classroom. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I've worked in some schools with behavior rooms and things like that where I've seen kids act out on purpose to get to go to the behavior because they have a para that they like there, or it turns out to be a reward.
Yep.
Do you see a problem with that? Is there any data?
We had that in the beginning when we first started implementing them, but then we started setting some specific parameters around what that room should look like. So for example, they always have to have access to their homework and be able to work on their work. They would always have a reflective process. Usually it's some sort of a sheet they work through on what happened, what got you here, what does that mean. Then we'd have to sit down and you'd have to process that with an adult. Then there would be a physical component to it where you would take a more, so it was very structured, much like school was, rather than just go in there and hang out and talk to so-and-so and solve your problem and go back to class. So it's really about the structure. Kids crave structure and consistency, and that's where you see the biggest problems with behavior, is when they don't have it.
So you mentioned working with schools council on the hearings and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent have the lawyers been involved in the preparedness kind of work? The how do we think about these things ahead of time?
Yeah. The incidences before they happen, like what?
Or like the policies and planning.
Mm-hmm. So like I said, every year we review them, and we kind of know there are some current topics that are kind of hitting the stage. And we also know that we're going to have to think about the implications that would have for our own practices and, more importantly, our board policy. And a lot of times, because I was in a building, lawyers, our general counsel have not been in buildings. They haven't been teachers. They haven't been administrators. So they don't know how it's going to practically play out and whether it's realistic or not. So he and I work very closely together and consult on things on almost on a daily basis, because it always is going to go back to what is our foundational policy and practice that we are implementing within our system rather than individual cases. And typically, I will tell you, we've had 2 expulsions in the last year. In the last 2 years, and before that we had not expelled 1 kid in 7 years before that. And they were, it was egregious, and I can talk about this now. You probably saw it was all over the news right after the election. It was the graffiti that happened in the bathroom stall with the racist graffiti and then the pro-Trump stuff. So that was the one student, and then the other student, he was a kid at one of our high schools who went in, and we had just built the new additions on all 3 of the high schools, and he decided to go and light fires in the bathrooms on the 2nd floor and the 3rd floor, and there were no cameras and our sprinkler systems were malfunctioning, so he almost burned down the building. Consequently, they finally went off and flooded the entire thing and caused hundreds of thousands of dollars of water damage in a brand new building 2 months after it opened. So that's what I'm saying, those are super egregious things. Yeah, that's going to get you expelled, but otherwise, we just don't.
You talked in the data about the suspensions and how it's gone down and then up the last 2 years, but you said there was incidence of suspensions. I wonder if you could talk about the number of individuals, what those numbers are. Does that follow the same trajectory? Is it different in particular in the last 2 years?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I didn't get too deep into the data, but what I will tell you is that when you look at our suspensions, the number of kids who have been suspended, we broke it into 3 different categories. One is by kids who have been suspended 1 time, kids who have been suspended 2 times, and kids that have been suspended 3 or more times. And our number of kids that have been suspended multiple times has dropped dramatically, even though the suspension has kind of upticked here in the last couple of years, where our number of suspensions who've only had 1 has gone up and replaced some of that piece. So it is making a difference that you're not seeing the repeat behavior, and there's very few kids at that top of the list. I'm talking it's less than 1%. So we broke it out by race, and we also broke it out by year again, and there was 1 year, I want to say, was 2011 or 2012, where we had exactly 1% of our student body that was actually being suspended. So it's a very low number in comparison to our enrollment numbers.
So you continue to see
Oh,
the
sorry.
number one reason for suspensions?
What's that?
What's the number one reason for suspensions?
It's the same thing every year, and this has been our work this year. Every time you look at it, kids predominantly, the referrals results in the suspensions. You don't suspend kids without referrals, right? So number one place you get referrals, classroom. Consistently, 2/3 of the referrals are out of classroom. The suspensions have changed, but the number of referrals that are written, 2/3 of them are for disruptive behavior and insubordination, the gray area. The suspensions have changed because, like I said, we don't suspend anymore for unsafe behavior, and that's all. And the things that we suspend for are physical aggression, physical assaults, obviously sexual assaults, guns, knives, weapons, that kind of stuff.
That's-
Can you talk a little bit more about some of the restorative practices, like what types of behaviors are most common in the restorative practice, and are there none it's like, for example, would you ever refer a drug case or unsafe behaviors that you mentioned restorative practices?
So restorative practices has 3 different levels, and the first one is about circle, having a restorative circle where there's a talking piece and you pass it around and each person gets to participate. There's a facilitator and they help guide the questions and everyone gets a chance to respond. We try and get schools to do that process before there's an incident that happens, so it sets the stage so when there is an incident, they could do a circle if they wanted to. So we've had elementary kids, we've had middle school kids, actually, and we have a couple teachers at high school who teach in circle, which is really interesting to watch because then every kid has to participate and be a part of it. So they kind of establish that culture. Then there's things called restorative chats, which is our tier 2 piece, which is really between a couple of individuals or a group of individuals that's small, 4 or 5 or 6 at the most. And then that's a different process where they're asking different questions and you have a facilitator. And then the egregious stuff that you're talking about, that's when we have CMRS come in and they'll do community conversations where it's like circle, but you bring everybody. So you might have the police liaison in there, a school counselor, the parents, the victim, the person who did it, the victim's parents, and try and resolve it that way. We have not used restorative conferences for the egregious stuff. In fact, actually, that was part of the complaint that was just published, that we just got a circuit decision on, is that the kid who did the graffiti, his attorney was arguing, why wouldn't you do restorative circles? Why wouldn't you do that? And our argument was, it was so egregious and so offensive that, and in order to participate in that, you actually have to admit that you did it. So part of it is they got to own responsibility for it and be willing to talk about it and be able to fix it. And so you can't do them in cases like that. Or the kid who started the fires, again, I don't know how you would do community conversations that large with 2,000 people. So sometimes the number is prohibited, especially when it's that egregious.
So I was looking at stuff about ASIO. There's also this sort of giving kids more activity time. So I saw kids doing yoga or kids in math class being active, using energy as the same time that they're using math. So how are you guys thinking about those kinds of interventions?
So we've implemented more so, I would say, at the elementary level, things like yoga calm or motor breaks where they have stations that they're maybe in a hallway or in a classroom where they can go and do a quick motor activity. And it might be jumping jacks, it might be leg presses, it might be a yoga pose, to try and burn some of that energy off because, kids are squirrely, especially those elementary kids, man, they are tiring. And so they want to just move all the time. They can't sit in desks or tables. At the secondary level, we have things like motor breaks that kids get where they might have a pass where they have a time limit where they make 2 laps around the first floor, or they have to be back in 3 minutes, or and then the teacher just flips the timer, and then the kids are really good about that stuff. There's some reflection rooms where they're calming pieces and things where kids can draw to just try and get some of that energy out, because every kid is different. So we've used a lot of motion and movement, and then tried to incorporate that, get our teachers to incorporate that, so they're not sitting still so long.
Leon?
2 questions. One to clarify, when you say referrals, do you mean like referrals to like get in trouble or just sped? Okay.
Yep, referrals to get in trouble.
Okay.
Just what typically you'd write. It's for both. I mean, they write them for both, but yeah, it's just to get in trouble.
Oh, okay. So then my second question, I guess, would be following up on that. Have you seen like referrals for like sped specifically like increase because like maybe that student has like a sensory issue or like learning disability or something like that? Like
We've actually seen them decrease because part of our other piece of work I didn't talk about was we were cited by MDE for the disproportionate number of special ed students being students of color, specifically our Black students. And so we worked really hard to try and identify what those were and incorporate some of those other components with either sensory pieces that they use or they do or places that they go. So those have actually decreased. Overall though, when you combine them all together, that's where I said it's hard to tell because referrals are used for different things now than they were a few years ago.
Just a quick backdrop, I used to teach and my classroom was seen as a good classroom because my kids behaved well.
Yeah.
And it was because I had the Latino students and so I didn't really get observed or paid attention to. But no one really cared about like the outcomes of my students in my classroom ultimately. So I know you hinted at it in terms of like helping outcomes, but what trends have you seen? Is there any correlation between the success you've had and then the outcomes of the kids?
Yeah, so in the places that have really kind of done it well, because when you have almost 30 sites, there's varying degrees of fidelity that it's been implemented with. Right? And you try and work with those that haven't done it as well, and you congratulate and try and praise the ones that have. And what you will see, particularly over the last 3 and 4 years, is the sites that have a strong PBIS program, restorative practices in place, kids are involved, and they have a voice. Their math and reading scores have actually increased. So, for example, last year when we got our scores, we have a middle school that is like our model middle school that has these components in place, and across the board consistently we've had chronic problems with the transition of our 5th grade students into middle school and 6th grade, and our scores have dropped because it's all so much, such a big transition. And in fact that middle school, they had the best scores that they'd ever had. So when you see this whole piece, and this is what I said earlier about culture and climate, safety, security, consistent and clear expectations, you see student achievement increase exponentially. Yeah, complacency and compliancy, I know what you're talking about.
So after doing the reading, some students posited that a lot of the pushback would come from parents. So for school boards and for parents, all of this can seem a little new, maybe a little new agey. And so it's like, oh, can this really work? So how's the experience been with your community around this?
So as I said, the teachers and the staff members, they have very similar thoughts, like, oh, these kids just want to go down there and hang out with so-and-so because it's the cool place to be. Because why? Because all their friends are in there and they're hanging out with someone that they like. So we've worked really hard to change that. That's why I've done that work with EMO. And they've done the research and the work with it because they don't know what they don't know. And so part of that work has been this year is that I go out and I offered to train anybody that would come. I'm like, I will do trauma training, I will do PBIS, I'm doing restorative practices training, mindfulness, why this is important to anybody, cook, custodian, secretary, And it's been very positive. The classes are packed. I've had over 70 people in each of those classes, and so now the word's getting out and they're buying into it. The parents usually, well, okay, I always say this, the kids are never the problem, it's always the parents, right? It's always the adults, because the parents of the person that you're willing to work with are very appreciative that you're trying to work with their kid and get them the support. It's usually the kids that have the parents of the kids that got hurt in some way of why isn't this kid expelled? Why do they even get to come back to school? This kid threw a pen, we had this the other day, threw a pencil at my kid's head, almost poked his eye out. Like, why is he not suspended for multiple days? Because he's 7. I mean, he throws things. I mean, he's a 7-year-old boy. And I don't think he was purposely trying to throw a javelin through, the kid's eye. So, but it's that pushback that we get. And then they show up and they write the board. Well, this kid punched my son on the playground, and he's still in class, and I want that kid out of my son's class. It's called compulsory education. We can't do that either. So, I mean, but of course you can't say it that way. And then the board, but we do have a board now, quite frankly, that is asking the same questions. Like, why do we have to do this? Why do we have to keep these kids in school? Because they don't understand the laws and the implications and the federal dollars that are tied to those decisions. So we've been spending a lot of time trying to educate them about, we can't, and here's why.
So the geographic variation in OSSEO is significant.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't gone back and looked at the actual numbers, but I'm going to assume that the eastern schools are more kids of color, and the western schools are much more white kids.
Yep.
So what are you seeing in variation of, across the schools as you're trying to make racial awareness so foundational and these other kinds of changes? How does that play into the demographic variation in schools?
So a lot of it is about teaching and learning for staff, and more about their own personal racial journey, what they have experienced, and getting that training to every staff person. So paras, cooks, custodians, bus drivers even. We've started trying to train them, teachers. And then the kids they've started their own groups to try and help train other kids. And again, it's just like the PBIS stuff. When it's done well and it's done with fidelity and it's constantly on the table and you're always putting race on the table as an administrator, as a teacher, as a parent, then you see the increase in achievement and the decrease in behavior and the identification of what is perceived for behavior. Conversely, it goes the other way. I will tell you, for the most part, what my experience has been, not just in OSSEO, but generally, is that it's not until you hit that tipping point of about 20 or 30% of students of color that the staff start to feel there's a crisis, because it's all those kids who are out of control. And that's really where you get the most movement, is once you move past that tipping point. And it's hard. I mean, it's hard because you're changing long-held beliefs in a predominantly white staff and in a predominantly white community. And that's not how they grew up, and they just don't get it.
You talked about CRT, and I was wondering, are you making connections or tying with the curriculum and instruction side in terms of specifically culturally responsive pedagogy, or even ethnic studies class courses?
Yes. So yes and yes. We've got our curriculum director and our director of educational equity and myself, student services. We have a model that we use called the CLEAR model, and it's about being culturally relevant. It's about learning at the center. We continue to talk about equitable student achievement. So how are we providing equal yet individualized instruction for kids to meet them where they're at contextually, and also with proficiency. We talk about achievement, and then we also talk about relevance. So what is the relevance? How is this relevant to the person that's sitting across there? And the best example I can give from my own personal life is my son took an AP Lit course in high school. And as you probably know, there's not a lot of guys who take AP Lit, right? So he comes home with his list, and it's like every female author, and it is Emily Bronte, and it's Wuthering Heights, and it's all of these books that traditionally are very dramatic, kind of soap opera-y, thematic books. And so he was like, Mom, why am I reading this? I don't want to read a Pride and Prejudice. Why do I want to read this? I don't want to read about a bunch of girls. And so for him, it just wasn't relevant. And it's the same thing in our system, where we're trying to provide experiences and choices so kids have those choices to choose what's relevant to them. And that's where we've seen the biggest achievement is with kids, that when they go to like the reflection rooms or the ATS room, that they have activities and things that they're doing that they identify with. So whether it's sports or whether it's a TV show or whether it's, you know, a certain topic. We have a kid who we found out wants to be a public speaker. Well, he just beat the crap out of somebody in the hallway, and he didn't say anything. He just beat him up. So you're like, where are the words there, you know? And so then we talked to him about who are your role models? Who do you like to see? And then had him work on a project that way in that class. So it's definitely about cultural relevancy and relatability.
So, challenges related to immigrant families in sort of cultural expectations.
So there are a couple things that you see pretty consistently, particularly with the fear of the immigration laws that have passed. We have a hard time getting families in to talk, let alone participate in anything with the school, because in some cases in our schools, more on the east side, we have non-documented immigrants in our school. And we can't ask that by law. We can't ask, you know, are you a citizen or are you not? And we don't want to know. But we have had a tremendous amount of fear, particularly last year and the beginning of this year, around the more I'm involved with school, the more I'm going to be on somebody's radar, and then someone's going to call on us. So that's been a real tough component, because we have a very high Hmong population, Somali population, and Liberian population, and so they don't want the school to be calling, because they don't want anyone to know who they are. The other side to it is when we do get to the point when we have to identify that kids might need more support through a special ed evaluation, culturally, that to them that speaks, and I'm overgeneralizing, and of course I'm making it, but this is what I've heard, is that then the assumption is something is wrong with their kid, and that would be shameful to have something like that, right? So they can't. So you frequently hear, that doesn't happen in our house. It happens only here at school. And so trying to break that barrier, which we've hired equity specialist teachers and cultural liaisons to try and go to the families rather than bringing them in to work through some of these issues, because it's only been exacerbated by all of the political components that have happened. There's a lot of fear and a lot of tension in the buildings. And it's just a common, it's almost like a common pressure you feel. And it doesn't matter politically what you believe, but the kids, you can sense there's just this stress, that just is this underlying stress, more so than there was a couple years ago.
ASIO seems to have made a big financial commitment to this, like with your position, with the kinds of other resources that you're talking about. So I guess my question is both the pressures of sustaining that and, you know, do you have counterparts in other districts? How unique is ASIO's approach in terms of having somebody in your role, and how could we do better across districts, not just within district?
Right. So we work with MDE, and we've the Minnesota Department of Education a lot, and we have partnered very closely with them, and we've learned about the places that do it well, and and some of the components of what they have, and try and learn from each other. I would say our racial journey, our equity work, is not unique in the sense that many people have done it, meaning Eden Prairie has worked with Pacific Educational Group, St. Paul has, Minneapolis has. There's lots of large districts that have. Where it gets contentious is the financial component. So after about 3 years, that's when you see people drop that work. And so then it's not being sustained. We do not have a contract with PG anymore for that reason, because our board said enough is enough, we spent too much money on that. But we also invested in a director of educational equity who is responsible for continuing to train and develop that work. St. Paul has one, Minneapolis has one, Burnsville has one, Bloomington, Bridgeville. Most districts have somebody who does that. My position is particularly a little more unique. A lot of districts don't even have assistant superintendents, they have a director or something. So even to have 3 assistant superintendents is unique, plus my position. But I do think it makes a difference in trying to sustain it and get it across all the sites.
Let's thank Sarah for a terrific presentation.
So thank you guys.
Thanks. Let's do a 10-minute break. That was really super. Thanks so much.
Yeah, anytime. Let me know if you want me to come back. I love talking about it, you know.
Great.
Have my flashbacks. Thanks again. Take care.
Have a good evening.
So bad. You don't want to go to the I do want to go to the and then after it'll probably be really fun. It's free. It's not like I have to pay $20. Which is sad because the women's team is amazing. Yeah, exactly. You'd think that would be the one you have to pay for. Yeah. It's like Wisconsin.
Well, no, but they're probably significantly cheaper.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Despite being like.
Do they really?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh. Well, good.
Wow. You're gonna see that. Some good teams.
Of course, that's true.
You don't say.
No, with Karen Mix or with Nicola?
Nicola. What is the name? Yes?
Nicola Alejandro.
It's not.
Mary.
I don't know what she's teaching this spring.
No, it's not.
Because today I tried
Oh,
to
They don't even get married.
check the OLTP offer because in Humphrey I select some courses for the course and I take Nicola.
I know it'll be cold.
Plan ahead, don't you?
Hey,
You can buy like a book in there, right?
Alexander.
Is the
Yeah.
but I don't know if it's in OLTP. Another, you know something that some teacher gives some special course in spring?
On in any kind of topic or anything?
Education.
Well, they were gonna offer it and then not enough people signed up.
Peter Demerath does anthropology of education. And also Karen Seashore is doing.
Because this is policy.
She does policy. So they're more into anthropology or I am taking the course Karen Seashore, which is I think sociology of education. So those are both in that domain.
Yeah, Nicole, that's what I
think
did.
Nichols was the only one who does policy politics
Oh, you want to take it?
specifically.
Yeah,
But what do you think?
but yeah.
But
So,
you will take in spring.
I'm taking the course with my advisor Khalifa, Mohammed Khalifa, and it's on leadership, culture, responsibility. And then Karen Seashore's class on sociology of education, and that's a part of she's retiring.
well, now you.
She's talking about what I've studied. So,
I
I
don't
don't
know.
know what third course. I've been looking for some courses here, but I haven't found it. I found one that was interesting, but realize
Because
it's too
here-
late to describe.
Okay,
Oh, sorry.
because here,
They're both
I don't find other in education. In the soft school,
There's very little.
I don't find other in education, no, for spring. Because maybe when I
I would
select
sign up, but
there are two other
they're not gonna allow that.
international education.
What's my topic? But
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I would look, I don't know what her offers are, but I would look at her offers and the strengths that she has. And I don't know a lot of personnel those because I'm new at some of them.
about a year,
What they're doing.
because in OLP,
There is a new, and I don't know anything about him, but there's a new professor who's like fixes organizational management or something.
In
Specifically in education. So I don't know, how good he is or it is.
I tried it the last semester. No, for this I tried to take a class so good. Comparative education.
Comparative education.
Comparative education. It's in all this.
Oh, no.
Yes, I take this. I took this, but I changed because
Oh.
I feel that was very difficult because it's very theoretical. You learn something about the methodologies to compare different systems of the world, and not only in USA. It's an
Okay, so so you know Fowler uses zoning as like her framework to discuss how things happen, like how policies are passed, how they're put on the agenda, like how so she actually
This goes, okay, I put some days, we have only 2 weeks to work. She did email me back. Yes.
do you feel confident, one, because you can point to them myself, you can do it.
One,
Two,
for
I feel confident because she came with me and I'm like writing this my program. Basically just like all the data that I am, just like a lot of program, but I like those and so like, but like
explain what it is.
yes. And the, she said like, what? I think so. Yeah, I would think, I would assume, I didn't ask her that specifically. And then another thing is that like, she says that we have to like narrow down on like, yes.
I would interview the principal of
We have to
Maxville.
like narrow down
Oh, yeah?
Yes, about the evaluation
Is
system.
Maxwell in Minneapolis or St. Paul?
It's a
Is St. Paul?
Yes.
Oh, good.
And I didn't find that information.
So good because it's a good teacher and now it's
So
a
from my example,
was the best teacher in some
Oh, he was like a
3 days
best teacher.
years.
Wow. And now he's a principal?
Now it's a principal of this school. The school is so good. Is, for instance,
What, Maxwell?
Maxfield.
Maxfield?
Elementary
that's how
school.
that is.
I don't know anything about it, I'm mentioning it last time.
It's a difficult school.
Yes.
Explain that.
It's elementary school?
How
It's elementary, yes, but
it was
there are a lot of
system, it was very
big grants.
But like, to make it
Yeah.
your common elder,
His perception is that it's cognition more. That's
is that
how
like, you talk like,
Really?
like, you talk about the policy, the problem,
you think that
and
I can't send you the
Oh, this is
video.
on the, this is where I am.
policy,
This is on the
yeah,
street where I
policy,
live.
problem.
So it's not the place.
I
You talk about those three.
Yes. I think
It's in Florida, yeah.
But like, that's what I told her I would do it on.
You feel that this evaluation is useful for provisional teachers
So before they have tenure, like the process before they.
I like, okay, maybe it's a variation, so it's for this kind of people that she, and well, like one, okay, this instrument is useful for quality or I find other things more useful, like one time for students, but we need more time to prepare our our students and prepare some strategies to attend each course. Yes.
Pardon me? We talked to another teacher in St. Paul, and she had some really interesting things to say about it. So, in what was useful to her and what wasn't useful, she was specifically because it depends on the school. This particular school, they spend a significant amount of time doing all these different things that you can, doing these different things you would do. And the school gives some support, but it's a lot of planning time. She found one of the components of it, which was your personal improvement plan, her individual improvement plan, she found that very useful. So she, because it basically gave her, a structure to sort of plan something where she can improve her class. She's actually a social education teacher, or ESL teacher, and sort of work on that. And so there's a structure for that. So that was useful for her. The other parts that were just the core observations were less useful for her because it was a big deal to. It was a big deal to have the observation of the rest of it. It was less useful. Well, yeah, it's just, I haven't been able to talk to him about it because I haven't been over that much in Minneapolis. I might want to because the last couple times I was in school in Minneapolis, it really, I wasn't like a teacher. I was really like a student teacher, so they
And Marie is a teacher of Oxford University. And I'm getting there because she is a teacher of theory, pedagogical theory. Yes, you know that the education teacher has three factors. One is mathematics, other is pedagogical theory, and other.
Yeah, and then skill. Is that what you mean?
And she is teacher of pedagogical components. Explaining all about the certification that is previously you obtain your position.
Right.
You need the certification to enter.
The licensing, right.
The license.
Right, your licensure courses.
Yes, the license. Okay, but she told me about the new things they can use. There are a lot of new things, no?
It was totally different. The new licensure, yeah, it's completely different. Remember,
Yes.
were you here that week? When they talked, because she had that handout that showed you the 4 different steps.
The name now is Belsby. It's a new system, Belsby.
I love that acronym.
Yes, it's a new board.
Oh, that's that board, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the licensing board.
I know. And Marie,
Yeah, professional educator licensing and standards board.
Yes.
I have 3 different, 4 different levels, no? Bachelor degree, and both teacher program, graduate teacher, and science, like that.
Yeah, those are the four tiers or the four.
Okay, let's talk about it like later in the class.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay. So first, while you're all trying to like absorb all the comments, just a little sort of general thing. So in the policy school, we teach this among other approaches to public policy analysis. One of the things we teach is by a guy named Bartek, who calls it the Eightfold Path. And he's got these various steps that you go through in trying to analyze a public policy problem and develop recommendations. And I don't even expect policy students to do the whole thing. But one of the things that you will see me ask is, what alternatives did you consider? And what are the criteria that you used? So if you're trying to decide between an Apple laptop and a Microsoft laptop, Surface or something like that, right? What criteria might you use to make that decision?
Cost.
Cost,
Build quality.
quality, design, look, software. Does it run the applications that I want or use most often, right? So now, when you've made a decision like that, how often have you actually listed those criteria for yourselves? You probably just said, I think this is the better of the two, and your brain just processed all these criteria, right? And okay, that is not the way we do this paper. This is a show your work kind of process where, like, how you arrived at the judgments for making recommendations, you have to explain to me how you did that. And one of the clearest ways to explain that is to tell me the criteria you used in arriving at that judgment. Now, for certain kinds of analysis, you may not be trying to evaluate alternatives for recommendations. You may be saying, maybe identifying a gap between a current practice and a standard. And so there, what you're trying to do is identify the ways in which the practice is not meeting the standard. So you're not necessarily evaluating a bunch of alternatives. You're trying to say, hey, this is where it falls short, and here's what you have to do in order to meet the standard, right? So there are lots of different kinds of analyses that you can do that don't involve this evaluation of different alternatives for purposes of saying, here are the options that we should pursue, okay? So some analyses, don't worry about this, but where you find yourself saying X should do Y, the should has to be supported in some way. And usually the support is that this option does better on 3 out of 4 of my criteria, right? Or something along those lines. And sometimes you can have more than one option that's a good option, right? But usually these options have drawbacks. In the Bardak approach, he asked people to look at trade-offs. And this can get, whether something is a negative criterion or a trade-off can get a little fuzzy, so I'm not too worried about that. But anyway, usually alternatives come with downsides. If an option has all upsides, one of the questions is, why aren't we doing it already? Right? So, a little bit of awareness of what those downsides are would be a good thing as you talk about the paper. So this is kind of consistent. Not everybody, but it showed up in multiple things. And so I'm by no means saying you got to do the whole 8-step thing, right? But what I find is the core of this for me as a person trying to understand your reasoning is what options did you really look at? I know the ones you like because they're in the paper, but were there some you didn't like? And what was it about them you didn't like? As on the way to picking ones that you did like. So, so that's the most common sense way I can explain, a way to strengthen your approaches to this is to be aware of the criteria that you're using, and the options that you both thought about, or maybe that you thought about but said, "Oh, that's too dumb. I'm not going to include that," but you did think about it. And part of your reasoning was, that's too dumb. And so it would, and that could help elucidate your thinking. You could say, well, why did I reject that? What was wrong with that idea? And maybe if I can make it explicit to myself about that, it'll be easier to explain it to somebody else. Any questions about that? Okay. So our potpourri of cases and readings for today. So here's one way I want to try to. We'll start slow. Different kinds of cases than we've been reading, right? So these are wrongs committed by individuals against another individual. So in law school parlance, that's a tort. Those are not a crime, but it's a wrong that's committed by somebody against somebody else. So it's a tort. And the particular kind of tort we're dealing with is negligence, where the harm inflicted was not intentional, but occurred as a result of somebody not exercising due care, or the care that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in those circumstances, right? So the London Bridge case sort of lays that out pretty well. So what would a reasonably prudent person in the position of a teacher teaching kids to do London Bridge the first time be doing? And so another character, something unusual about this whole set of cases that I just remarked on. I've been doing this for 3 or 4 years. So we've included all cases that were tried to the court. There aren't any juries involved in this, which is really kind of interesting because typically in a tort case you might have a jury decide whether somebody breached the standard of care. And that makes perfect sense. I mean, you get 6 ordinary people and you ask them the question, did this person's conduct breach the standard that would have been used by a reasonably prudent person in this situation, right? But in this case, we're just asking a judge to decide on that. So all these cases are instances where the judge either said, yes, they breached the standard of care, or no, they didn't. So that's the London Bridge case where they did breach the standard. The other thing here that's important to point out is evidence. So anybody notice anything sort of striking about the welding case?
The teacher in the teacher's deposition talked about, he said, no, I don't do that. I was shocked when I read that too.
Okay.
No, it's not my job.
Yeah, the court doesn't say that, but like if I'm the lawyer, I'm like total sinking feeling. As soon as those answers come out of the guy's mouth, and I'm also sitting there thinking, okay, did I have an opportunity to prepare him for this deposition? And in preparing him, did I not ask him these kinds of questions and give him a chance to provide better answers than the ones that he did provide? A couple different ways that lawyering was at fault there. Yeah, so like, and the court doesn't spend a lot of time on this, but you have to think they had a really bad reaction to a guy saying, it was not my responsibility to watch out for these kids, right? I mean, sometimes the decisions about this stuff, despite our rationales about them, boils down to, this guy was in charge of these kids. So anyway, so one is the sort of evidence. You can't totally predict what will actually become evidence. I'm assuming that the school district's lawyers did their best to try to anticipate what Mr. Hastings might say. But once he said it, even if he really, who knows what frame of mind he was in, but even if he didn't really mean it, once he said it, that's the truth for purposes of the case. And regardless of what the abstract truth is, the truth is what he said. And so the truth is that they had a guy in the district supervising welding class who had a limited view of his responsibility. So I think that's a key thing to pay attention to, is that the evidence is really important. That was what this court was struggling with in the London Bridge cases. How much credence do I give to a 7-year-old compared to the teacher or the other kids in the classroom, right? I don't know. So then you have the pencil case, and so here as several of you pointed out, the court is getting a little bit more protective of districts and of teachers, and this notion that teachers can't be all over the place. But so that quick discussion is the lead up to this question: how might the evidence have been different if the schools in that school district had adopted PBIS or restorative practices, or any of the kinds of things that you heard Principal Vernon talking about? See, how might the evidence? What would you do as the lawyer if the evidence was that the school had been practicing PBIS?
Probably focus on the procedures related to PBIS and put the negligence claim more there, depending on what side you're on, but follow up. Maybe the behavior itself is the teacher is not acting negligent, but the school might have acted negligent.
Well, here's one way to think about it. So you're the teacher who taught them London Bridge, and you testify. Well, one of the reasons I thought I could turn my back in this situation was that we had been spending several months in school before I taught this, talking about the Crimson way of treating people, and that includes treating them safely, not being mean to people, doing all those kinds of things. So you've done a whole bunch of stuff on the front end to get children thinking about, even little kids, thinking about how to treat each other. Then you teach them the game, and then you turn your back. You have a different story to tell to the court about how you were thinking about that situation, because you had tried to prepare the kids differently than these kids were prepared.
Is that a little bit what you were getting at when you asked her, what have your lawyers been doing to prepare teachers? Like, is that maybe more some of the thinking behind that framework and stuff?
I'm less clear about that. That's more the sort of the ivory tower academic sitting here thinking, well, gee, what would I do if I was in that lawyer's shoes? Or and I might be. I am in the position where I can sit and think about does active practice of PBIS actually help you on the liability side? Because you are trying to inculcate this set of principles about how children treat each other, how students treat each other, that may give you a little leeway if, in some cases, kids will still be kids, right? And so I don't know the answer because I think PBIS and those kinds of things are too new. I did miss that. I'm assuming she meant an appellate Minnesota Court of Appeals case regarding that graffiti case. So I got to look that up. But I'm assuming that PBIS and restorative practices are new enough that we don't have litigation where that's been part of the evidence that goes in about the context of these kinds of events. Same thing for the pencil case. I mean, as it was, the court said there wasn't liability. But what if the teacher had been able to say, during this time out at recess, one of the things we were doing was having kids reflect on the appropriate treatment of each other and not doing certain kinds of dangerous things and all that kind of stuff. So it's like we weren't ignoring. And I think that's a key part of the message here regarding the lawyers on the front end, is how do you help make sure that your clients are prepared in the right way? You can't foresee everything, but are there some tools that can help you anticipate? And sort of what's interesting about the role of PBIS is that it's proactive, not reactive. In a lot of cases, okay, so we had the knife in school case. So now it's pretty clear to ASIO that they couldn't have kicked that kid out anyway, because they were going to have a hard time proving intent with respect to the gun in the trunk of the car, right? So how can you prepare better for, how could you change the student's perception of things so that they are more aware? I think this question of anticipation and awareness, there are limits to what we can all foresee, but I think the lawyer's job in this situation is helping the districts with risk management in advance, before the explosion event shows up. And that's what I was getting at when I asked her the question is, are the lawyers actively engaged on the risk management side in adopting policies and understanding these practices and those kinds of things? And I got a wishy-washy answer about that. Any reactions, thoughts about that? I mean, it's not in any of the readings, but as I was thinking about the role of evidence in these kinds of things, the interesting thing will be when a school's positive practices are potential evidence, and what kind of exculpatory effect will that have with respect to claims like this. It was interesting to hear the accused assert that he had an alternative right to restorative practices instead of expulsion. I got to read that case. See what the court said about that. But I think there are going to be consequences on the legal side from the adoption of these things. I think they're going to be positive, but there are potentially some negatives too. Okay. So then we have concussions. So there's another key piece here. In both the Welding case and the one of the concussion cases, there were standards. There were broader standards at play that the court was comparing people's attention to. But those standards were evidence of what a reasonably prudent person would do. Okay, so another thing to pay attention to on the preparation side, on the anticipation side, is to be aware of the standards applicable to certain kinds of activities, and to sort of test with your client in advance. How good a job do you do of making sure that you have X and O supervisors on the playground or in these situations if the standard is one adult to 40 kids or whatever it is. Or, you know, are you, if you run a welding class, are you checking to make sure that you comply with the ANSI standard with respect to welding? And if not, why not? Those are questions that can be asked in advance regarding the standards that are applicable to the kinds of conduct that schools engage in. So that, I think that's important. Jim pointed out that standards may have changed a little regarding how we think about concussions. And I think that's totally true. I mean, certainly when I played high school football, if we had a guy with a concussion, he was back on the field in relatively short order. Just shake it off. And now we have have regrettably seen the consequences of lifelong exposure to brain impacts and sort of a much different understanding of the role of concussions, and then the legislature stepped in, and because the tendency is going to be to let kids play, even if you don't have a super gung-ho coach who wants to keep the kid in order to win the game, you're still going to have parents wanting their kids in the game, and so it helps to have statutes that you can point to and say, I think he had a concussion, or she had a concussion. He or she is not playing until she gets seen by somebody who knows what they're doing with respect to evaluating for concussions. Maybe disappointing on game day, but it's probably better in the long run. But it's a situation where it makes sense for the legislature to step in and say, this is the rule. Because there's otherwise too many pressures to compromise regarding the safety of kids. And lots of parents, lots of coaches wouldn't, but just in case. That's a fairly good thing to do. So I had not included in previous years the sexual harassment stuff. So is that helpful to people in sort of understanding some current context? I found it a reasonably good educating me about reactions. Court being too tough on it's pretty, you know, the article emphasized pretty high standard with respect to the kind of conduct you have to prove. Deliberate indifference and the repeated pattern, intentional conduct.
I thought it was interesting studying this from 2016, how little time that the office spent on online cyberbullying, especially because I think that's where a lot of it's going to be going forward.
Yeah. Though,
that could have sort of just like
I don't know, Steve, recent news suggests that a lot of it is still way too physical. You know, but yeah, I mean, yes. You know, and they probably, other people are focusing on cyberbullying. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing some of the elementary school conduct. I mean, the things you have to watch out for as an elementary school teacher or administrator, not just a high school or college administrator. Yeah, and so yes, when Sarah sent me the slides on critical race theory, I thought, okay, good thing we had Simpson's article in there to lay some foundation. In a way, it's kind of amazing how far OSSEO has come, because several of you commented on the challenges that, with respect to implementation of some of these ideas. And the fact that a really big school district, that as she pointed out, is predominantly white, has a white governing board. And they seem to have come, I mean, it's not Minneapolis and St. Paul, which are majority people of color in the district. So, so I think that's a pretty long way for them to come. We had, like the Hopkins School Board has 7 school board members and 3 new ones just got elected. I mentioned this before. The oldest one is 38. So the other thing that I think is going to happen is that there are going to be some generational shifts. And because all 3 of these students, well, one of them was Somali, but school board members, all 3 of them talked about the equity issues and restorative practices as something that they wanted to see done more of. And so you have, in this case, not trying to persuade existing board members, but new board members coming in sort of tuned for this kind of conversation. So there are signs of hope regarding progress on this, but as Sarah said, there's still a lot of pushback too. So besides just sort of people thinking that it's going to fix it, that somebody else is going to fix it for them, are there sort of active sources of resistance where at the schools where you're talking about implementing?
I mean, yes, in the sense that the PBIS requires consistent, as she was saying, consistent messaging. There are teachers who just refuse to participate in that messaging, and a lot of it also is just relationship building, and teachers just sort of act resistant. That she mentioned teachers pushing kids' buttons, and there's just active resistance to buying into the entire process.
Nodding your head.
I agree. I noticed with the teachers that I coached, it was kind of either fell in one of 2 camps. You were either about it or you weren't about it. And for a lot of teachers that weren't about it, I assess a lot of it had to do with the fact that restorative practices require everybody to have some level of vulnerability and talk about, here's what I thought happened, here's my feeling about it, and admit that the teacher could be wrong and they weren't willing to be in a situation where they could be seen as not being powerful, being incorrect, which is hard.
We don't have a lot of humility role models right now. Brandon?
I will say that like even for the teachers who are with PBIS, I know like my colleague, her son is like in 1st grade and she goes to school where they do PBIS, and the thing she really had a problem with was that I don't know, he had some it was a big block of Legos or Duplos or whatever. They were like, oh, just think of a creative way to deconstruct it and put it back together or something else. And he threw it at the ground, thinking well, that's the fastest way to get it into pieces so that I can put it back together. And then he got, some disciplinary measure for you don't throw things and destroy the class property, and that's not the values we're trying to do in our classroom. And so I think there is some concern even when she's on board and some well-intentioned that sometimes you might be trying to inculcate too much discipline or orderliness, and so I can see where, she certainly had a pushback in that.
Well, and he may not have had the resources to say it was an act of creativity.
Right.
Right.
It's interesting because my experience using restorative justice in my classroom is kind of the idea that when you ask the students the students are harsher disciplinarians than I would be. So, and this is with kindergartners, so they're really little kids, but focusing on having a group discussion in essence, what happened and who got hurt and what are we going to do to help that person, and that that helps to guard against that kind of reaction. Maybe not from a parent because they're not there and they might just see the end result but not know it. but be participatory for everybody. And yes, the big problem is that a lot of teachers don't want to be participatory; they want to cede that control. But by having this group discussion, it really takes away from the punitive nature, because there's a collective or there's a collaborative process to resolve it that everybody gets to sort of be part of.
In various, like with the, in effect, we've tried some of the alternatives. So, like ASIO has tried the discipline grid. We've tried zero tolerance policies. And besides the disproportionate racial impact that some of those policies have had, they also haven't worked. So, in some ways, trying something that is a positive intervention, even if you I may not buy the brand name PBIS, but I get the idea about intervening in a positive way rather than reacting, and I think that's my personal intuition is that that's a good thing, but the other part of me says, yeah, it's worth trying because we've tried these alternatives and they haven't worked. So this is the best new alternative that we've been shown, and there's some preliminary evidence that it works. And apparently it doesn't seem to be helping with the disparities much, because those graphs sort of came down together for both the African Americans and the whites.
Well, that's why I asked her the question about the number of individuals, because that's, I know, from my work in LA, that there's a big difference when you have a big spread of people committing one, getting suspended once. That's very different when you have this cluster of multiple offenders, as it were, because there's other forces at play, like the changes in the school and the grade levels, and we're getting used to that. But having, to me, it's the measure of people who are repeat offenders. That's a real measure of the efficacy of your program, because, somebody, they're kids, people are going to make mistakes, but the question is, are they going to continually do that,
Yeah, Natalia mentioned the sort of interaction of security and safety. So the shooting out in Northern California, where the gunman was outside the school, and the school had practiced lockdowns often enough that as soon as somebody heard a shot, they alerted the whole school and locked down and had the kids under their desks. One student was injured as a result of a bullet coming through the wall, but otherwise the students were safe, and the gunman tried to get into the school and couldn't. So, one of the other programs I teach in is the Security Technologies program. So unfortunately, in that program, I get to learn about all the things that we've done to try to prepare for active shooters and various other bad things that happen, and be in that mindset. And then also the notion of practicing for those kinds. And, so we, like when I was a kid, we had two drills. We had the fire drill and the nuclear bomb drill. Apparently in Hawaii, nuclear bomb drills are back, but after a long hiatus. But anyway, but the amount of practicing that we did for that was pretty limited. The fire alarm goes off, you all roll off, but you go out the doors and you stand there and you're thinking, God, I'm glad that happened during an exam or something, right?
Yeah.
But now schools have to practice this much more in depth, much more thoroughly. In a way, that's what we're doing on this school safety and discipline side. We're asking schools to practice alternative ways of behaving instead of waiting for the bad thing to happen and then figuring out how to respond. And so I think those are positive things happening to, not, it's a sad fact that we have to do them, especially on the school security side, but the fact that we are practicing these things in ways that make us better prepared and can help prevent them, I think is a positive thing, and relates back to that point I made earlier about the evidence, is that the better job we do on the preparation and practice side, the better off we will be both for safety, for positive school climate, and for the security of the kids in the school. So I think there's some value in seeing how these things relate to each other across the different topics. Because you have to do the same, the schools that get into trouble under Title IX are the ones who are acting as if it's not happening here. As opposed to if you assume that it's happening, what can I do to do a better job of preventing it, and what are my systems for detecting it, right? It's the same. For cybersecurity, right, we're all about systems for detecting intrusions, right? So maybe we need some systems for detecting, getting early warnings about sexual harassment or interracial conflict or those kinds of things. And so that's another place where lawyers, I hope, can make a difference, is in helping schools think about what kinds of detective, constitutionally consistent detection systems can we put in place that don't, violate kids' privacy, but do give us some advance warning of things that are going on in time so that we can address it before a survivor's damages are worse, or the school gets into trouble. So I think that's the key lesson I draw from this set of cases is that we now have technologies, ways of doing things, practices and procedures that enable us to do a better job of preparing in advance. And one of the things we need to think about is a way to apply those more consistently across the different behavior challenges that schools may face. So, any other comments, questions, reactions to the readings? So the plan is for a little bit more group. Let me talk about next week first. So I have to. This one is always the hardest thing because I'm always looking for innovations. So the last, when I started in my role as the chair of the Senate Education Committee, it was a time period when people were really critical of public schools. So I asked our staff to find examples of great things happening in schools. So like the first hearing that we did was schools coming in and talking about the cool stuff that they were doing. So this Ascension School, which is a Catholic school on the north side of Minneapolis, came in and talked about their violin program that they were doing for inner city kids. A whole range of things. So I have this bias towards the positive innovation stories. So that's how we're going to end the class, is by talking about positive innovation stories. So Jay Haugen, who's the superintendent at, I always get confused with a southern suburban school district. And then John Bacall, who's the founding director of Venture Academy, which is a charter school over on University Avenue, and Brandy Pottle, who's from Maxwell Elementary School. And she's using junior civic achievement methods with special education kids. So,
And so they're going to be our speakers. So I have to do the readings, and that's always the good news is there's too many things to choose from, and I can never decide at the last minute. So I will do that hopefully tomorrow. So those will be the readings. Those are the speakers. And then at the end of class, I'll leave time for the written evaluations. And then the following week will be the presentations. So tonight, time for the teams to work on presentations, and then to the extent that we have time, I'll try to do short consultations, but then recognizing where everybody is on the papers and that some of my comments might have been kind of extensive and maybe need a conversation, we can talk about additional time for office hours outside class too. Okay? Okay, so teams, and so that we do this in an orderly way. You can get on a list. So everybody can kind of predict who's up next. Okay?
Can we put on things up?
Yeah. Sure. Let me stick this one first.
I come directly from work. I'm working in the city attorney's office.
What's that?
I can imagine.
I do, well, I get done at 2. So it's a little easier. On Wednesdays, I make it happen. Wednesdays, I make it happen. Tomorrow,
So what are you doing
So that was.
Either one. Figuring out where to
So that was, like that was a little bit better. Right, they go to the store, we'll see you guys in the game.
Yeah, right.
And it's also a new process, like she was there were two,
reading a lot of her that she's approaching.
Yeah, right, so the teacher talking about, she's right, and
that she's like, she's only working on site. So I don't get what conclusion to arrive at. I just want to have, some practical decisions. So I think a little bit more on and looking at some of the transferring materials and then addressing it. So I'm not asking you to do like a whole lot more. I think that's the other aspect. I think in covering it really I pointed out some particular places where I thought you need a lot of work, right? But the overall thing is was personnel issues. ESA really just, there are these kinds now, so as I get to kids if they come in, we're going to say something about and you never
And that's one of the facts that you're particularly about Arizona. So when there's, legislature, some pass all these or one of the tax nonprofits and like making hundreds of thousands of dollars doing that, kind of like right? So that's just a particular kind of pushback. It's not necessarily to all of your institutions. That's an example. And then like I am confused about the interaction with classrooms, where I'm having trouble figuring out how that works because there is a inherent child is entitled to a safe and so this one is giving them $10,000. Going to be sustainable to parents with kids with so when you talk about that, and another example. Yeah, it's all the website. Here's a way is you tell the reader. I recognize that you might have a question about this. I didn't know that, right? But there might be a question. I thought about it. I went looking for all the sharing right? So you're at least communicating to the reader that you're on the reader's side and asking questions. Does that make sense? No, So if you think about your one of the criteria so ESA are good, but parents raise for the all this issue. Now, one of the other criteria what happens to quality? Where do those go? I don't know. And like that's one of the reasons I raised the question about homeschooling partners. With some parents like to live in homeschooling, but are we getting better results? Because parents control goes up. But in some homeschool situations, the quality of the education is not. So the educational quality might be a criteria. And then
I'm going to make sure
you've got classroom there in terms of so are there any other criteria? Right? I'm sorry, pulling them all together. And then, asking yourself, I found that. Like when you recognize making sure that these are non-tax. That's kind of a tax component. And if you think about those four criteria, but it's neutralized education quality, and it might increase the cost. See what I'm saying?
to the state, right? And so if I see that you're applying these criteria consistently across the ideas that you're testing, then I have a sense of how you think. Does that make sense to you? Yeah, those are criteria. Like, how do I know that this is a good thing? You usually think it's a good thing for the parent, right? So then, what are the other things, or what are the things that might be? What are the axes or dimensions or categories on which it might be that? Those I think are risks and ways to, I mean, you don't have to, but I'm just saying, these are some of the things that people might do. The typical ones are cost. Is it effective? Does it work? That's where I think cost, effectiveness. Is it politically feasible? Now that, I don't know, you have to, I'm not urging you, that's just like, is it simplistic? Or as opposed to complex. And these are just different things that the person might use. That's the okay. The system. I'll learn a lot by reading it. This is something for learn more. So I say, this is also you find ways to trim, no problem. How do you use this is just where did I ask the question? You guys. Oh, yeah. And it's where, yeah. So, and you make it advertise about Arizona. And if I think, okay, I get the point that maybe Nevada's decision wasn't there. But still, and you don't have or say the funding yeah, and yes, we're on you might think about that. The other thing about which is kind of one of the cases that went up to the Supreme Court. So that was decided on standing. And then also, and the Supreme Court said that taxpayers things like I found that's totally outrageous. That is now the law. So more like so what I read is that case hasn't necessarily more than applications. And I don't know how you want that in there. And there's another as you say, there's like there's 6 cases found in favor. One of them it survived, but it wasn't because of affirmative U.S.
I go back and I really think that's not
Yeah, and I think that was on the scholarship, tax scholarship. So they actually, you know, you might not have to necessarily think it all. I'll tell you when I'm doing one of the other classes that are still in Minnesota, we have a law that specifically says that tax expenses are another way to accomplish the same goal. Yeah, so tax expenses also tax credit or tax exemption. So we in Minnesota actually have a law that says that these two sorry. Yeah, but we think they are because if you didn't grant the credit, that would be wrong. So we see them as so now not every state has that law. So one of the questions that I would put is the application of these scholarships and the ESA that we treat as tax expenses. They don't function as well, but from a budget planning perspective, right. But it's one of my reasons for being cautious about saying this could work anyway.
Although what I was saying that I was saying is in regards to
And then there's another qualification. Which is both states.
All these steps. So, I did want to tell you that the word script I gave it in there was not so the question was that solely for kind of outline where I was going.
Okay. But it was enough to worry.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. When I saw that, I was okay, yeah. But no, I know that it basically the ESPN this was
and the money is not.
Yeah.
So it
was complied with the cover
this survival and there is the training and distribution.
I did see that show. I didn't.
So remember, there was casting 60 to help motivate people.
Yeah.
And the allocation was based on the number of
I've been helping them with it. Yeah, it's also fixing the head with the money for state school. That's why I didn't see that in.
So like this one would give a lot more.
Yeah, you think about that aspect of how that money was going to be distributed.
Yeah, so, I mean, and that's not the right, it's but it's like, there's no place to do it, you have to drive. The national model is not
everything that it wants to do,
yeah. So, the time.
It's evolved.
So the thing that's mining there's a state model that's not very clear. Something's used
that's how it's the money gets them.
Like that would be a whole of your analysis.
It's going to sound yeah. We've got a system instead where you know, your parents get the function, you have to go in time. And as long as you are on that, as long as you're and one of the issues with that is that they we're concerned that when the parents is like I said, there's all kinds of issues with this that I think really narrow down probably three areas. I think like three areas.
So here's the strategy, right? You tell me and then you put a boundary. Say that's not even and have as long as you are drawing the boundary, I get to make the paper happen. And what I encourage you to do is you have work on the paper. Where you're putting the boundary, so that you know if you're aware of it. But
where one of them would be general issues around organization. And then the second one would be well, people are trying not to do something that's
yes, no, and that's why they're putting boundaries.
so I'm just trying to do it really down to one law that basically show why this is unconstitutional and you get addressed first.
Also, you can get about that. One of the thoughts I had was whether it was violating accessibility.
That taken out of the place that hadn't looked at yet. I had gone to that I could definitely see how that could be.
Because it's like all the money.
Yeah. If you wait for it far away, you're going to be far.
Not that you have.
I mean, that wasn't so I told you that definitely had a way to look at.
Yeah, I don't understand. But anyway, yeah, when you look at it, it does say HR, and then right under it says bill. So luckily something got wrong.
My understanding is that the sort of resolution that's my understanding. I do go real quick after I take the public on here. Wait a minute. Yeah, my understanding is that still in the community with all the resolution.
Yeah.
Again, that's just my, because I can
And that sounds like,
beyond that, you have a plan in mind, and it's not, but it's very
so like, I'm going to be type test to read anything else, but if you stuck and want to hear me again,
right.
Too bad. Well, depends how big. I only I just think.
Right. Well, hopefully it's more helpful So you have whatever you do. So and then as you learn more about it, you say, oh, there are ways that NCTU can do that, right? And if school is offensive, I have to define reading. Yeah, but it's like, so this is like, you know, it's not like, it's like, here's where here's my we're treating it as a course.
What it feels like, so this is
So then they're
Right. Yeah. You also get 190. There are a lot of papers. So I'm gradually getting back into your paper.
I would definitely. Yeah, I thought you were saying. But no, yeah.
And this one, I was really wondering
Oh, no, I mean, if it's just like a picture of him and like, you know how
a more comprehensive student-teacher experience.
Yeah, that one is like I would.
That's what I was asking about, because I thought it was an additional, I thought you were saying, when I put that down, exactly where I was hearing about it, we're going to have a more extensive teacher experience, and we're going, they aren't going to go really good for another 2 more years. We're going to, yeah, but oh, now here's the question I understand that. So when we had he was making 20,000 as an argument for limiting.
This was the argument for
Yes. Yes. So even if it's in the student-teacher context, the student-teacher there's a potential barrier for and so it's like, so this is another way of asking, what about the balance of you incorporating this?
Stay over here. So I allow.
I would be okay with that if you have an and that's where you're passionate and the other recommendations that I
also think that I work this out. I think I was right on the point, right? And then I think that experience is the number one measure of the outcome.
When I ask a question, let's say something.
Okay, so and then they
So,
what
would you, and you have an answer in terms of some others. But I'm asking you by saying, okay, if we were giving you this direction we wanted to do, what would the minimum
About to.
But are they teaching how, what do they have to do to actually teach how Okay, but isn't that the question? Right? Is administration, say the legislature totally agreed and said, okay, but this is our problem. It's like, we have indirect influence on the teaching colleges.
They're trying to be on their hands off.
What are the, yeah, but you know, what are the levers I can pull as the legislature? Do I say, and really, and this is actually critical, do I say that nobody can become a teacher until 2 years? 2 years of student. Is this like saying there's got to be a 2-year residency for that?
So potential barriers. That means as well for schools right now that keep your law.
And the school district is saying, there's this transition period, right? So it's like, I think you're on a good path. But I want you to think about, how do I actually get this thing and keep them on their head? And how would you answer? With it or without it. With it or without it.
Okay, so I think maybe I may push that. I think I might just put in the notes. Okay, so
Just tell me.
All of this is going to be more expanded.
Just tell me that there are other issues. Like you're.
Oh, I know, but that's what
There's like a limitation. Right? Just tell me.
Thank you.
Sunday. I don't even know that.
I think we answered our question. This year the mayor's gonna use
Okay.
Sir.
Yes, sir. I'll be respectful of your time. I don't have anything to discuss regarding my paper. You know, I'm sorry.
Well, right
The
now.
excuse I had that I went too well. And with that comes certain media. But what I want to ask you about is, so this Friday, I'm doing an interview with
So I'm gonna
I think it's turning into a piece. But anyway, it's interesting. Maybe I'll try shopping around. But what I'm going around asking people is, I mean, you surely know quite a bit about the president, quite a bit along some stories, and what is something you really want about basically?
Well, that's a hard question. He was in the Senate for a short time. Yeah, so, from a legislative perspective, this is, I really think this is biggest accomplishment while he was in the Senate. And what do you find most valuable about that experience? You know, there's a lot of, everybody focuses on his presidency, campaign, then being ambassador and all that stuff. But as a former legislator, it's hard on you because I'm old enough that I should have a vague recollection of seeing him on TV as a senator worried about, I think, child nutrition. And it's like, I mean, and I could be totally wrong. Those are, that's the set of things that I would ask him from.
Yeah, so considering that we're for school, I've been reading a lot of I've been reading some of the memoirs, and just pulling up every year, getting an idea of what's already out there. The only reluctance I have is that, I mean, there are some popular that people know about it. Giving microphones and tell the same story, which are good, it's very charming. If you're in the room, it's you want to get people like good, like, I mean, it's the elder statesman. Yes. And that's, you know, and I'd like to dig deep in that. You know, it's like, I know that right now, we're coming on the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, which he led the charge of. And so he's getting a lot of airtime as a police or I don't know, I've heard of Aaron Gary Icahn, you know, some of the mentors that and so, yeah. So when it comes to asking questions about legislative accomplishments, like trying to find what would be a unique angle to like point something, like to make this interview like worthwhile, excited, to fill a gap in the literature.
Yeah, you know, people maybe will cite that because that's what you're getting right now, but I would push beyond that and sort of his one way of framing it is that sometimes your biggest and most recognized is the one you're the most
How does one go to a question like that? I mean, because
if they look, there's timing,
so this